Steve Austin didn't start out as a hero people remember. Before The $6 Million Man became a weekly hit, the character was already in trouble. Not because the science didn't work, and not because the idea was too strange, but because television couldn't decide who Steve Austin was supposed to be. What the early films presented was Steve Austin 1.0, and it didn't work. Instead of a damaged test pilot struggling to survive his injuries, Steve Austin was pushed toward a James Bond-style government operative, a globe-trotting spy dropped into glamorous missions filled with foreign villains, luxury settings, and fantasy-scale danger. That version didn't connect. It didn't just miss the mark, it nearly stopped the show from becoming a series at all. What audiences eventually embraced was Steve Austin 2.0. A rebuilt character, less spy fantasy, more restraint, more humanity. This is a story of how the $6 Million Man had to abandon its first identity and fundamentally rebuild its lead character in order to survive. The bionics were never the problem. Finding the right version of the man was. Before the $6 Million Man became a weekly series, Steve Austin already existed on screen. That version of the character was introduced across 3 90-minute television movies produced for ABC's Movie of the Week. On paper, the concept was strong. A grounded science fiction premise, rooted in real aerospace research, adapted from Martin Caidin's novel Cyborg. But the way Steve Austin was presented in those early films pulled him in a very different direction. ABC steered the project toward the dominant television language of the early 1970s, a formula that had already proven successful elsewhere. International intrigue, glamorous villains, and beautiful women. A larger-than-life spy tone shaped by the lingering influence of James Bond. The result was a version of Steve Austin that looked impressive on the surface, but felt fundamentally wrong. In the second and third installments, Steve Austin is framed less as a damaged test pilot struggling with what he's become, and more as a polished government operative, dropped into globe-trotting espionage plots. He moves through luxury settings, foreign compounds, and exotic locations. He flirts, he infiltrates, he survives explosions that feel closer to fantasy than engineering. This wasn't subtle. Martin Caidin, the creator of Cyborg, was openly furious with the direction. He dismissed the Bond influence outright, arguing that the films had abandoned the realism and restraint that made the premise compelling. Steve Austin, as Caidin conceived him, was never meant to be a spy. He was a pilot, a man rebuilt not to save the world, but to survive it. On screen, that distinction was steadily erased. Steve's trauma is introduced, but quickly sidelined. His emotional dislocation is acknowledged, then smoothed over. He moves too easily through danger, too comfortably through seduction, too confidently through missions that demand very little introspection. Even visually, the scale is loud and external, framing Steve as an answer rather than a question. And audiences didn't respond the way ABC expected. The original pilot performed strongly, ranking as the 10th most watched program that week. The follow-up movies failed to build momentum. The concept hadn't collapsed, but it hadn't found its footing either. The character at the center of the show felt interchangeable. He could have been almost anyone. That was the real problem. Steve Austin wasn't broken because the science was unbelievable. He was broken because he didn't have an identity that television could sustain week after week. The version of the character being presented simply didn't match the man audiences would eventually connect with, the quiet, restrained, stubbornly human figure who would define the series. That version didn't exist yet, and without it, the $6 Million Man wasn't a show. It was just another TV movie trying to ride a trend. The failure of Steve Austin wasn't a creative mistake. It was a format problem. The earliest versions of the $6 Million Man were built as television events, oversized, self-contained movies designed to feel cinematic. That approach worked once, it couldn't work every week. A James Bond-style premise depends on escalation. Bigger locations, higher stakes, louder threats. A model that works for occasional films, but collapses under weekly repetition. You can't save the world as a recurring event and expect it to last. Those 90-minute movies were expensive, time-consuming, and increasingly restrictive when repeated. More importantly, they didn't scale. Television survives on returnability. Audiences come back week after week to a world that feels familiar enough to revisit, but flexible enough to explore. Steve Austin didn't offer that kind of stability. His conflicts were almost entirely external: foreign agents, kidnappers, shadowy organizations. Once the mission ended, the story reset completely, leaving little emotional residue to carry forward and making long-term character development nearly impossible. Budgets, schedules, and production timelines were already being pushed to their limits. Producing repeated 90-minute action films was unsustainable. Translating that same model into a 1-hour weekly series would have burned through money, locations, and story logic at an impossible pace. Even the people shaping the show recognized the strain. What worked as a cinematic experiment became unwieldy as a weekly proposition. But the most important issue wasn't cost, it was connection. Steve Austin was impressive, but distant. Capable, but sealed off. He functioned well as a figure you watched, not someone you lived with week after week. The show hadn't yet found a version of the character flexible enough to absorb smaller stories, personal setbacks, and recurring relationships. Without that shift, the $6 Million Man would have remained a strong pilot followed by diminishing returns, a concept that arrived fully formed and immediately exhausted itself. The idea didn't need to be bigger, it needed to be reshaped. And that's where the rebuild began. By late 1973, the $6 Million Man was at a crossroads. The concept had proven it could attract attention. What it hadn't proven was that it could last. That's when Harve Bennett entered the picture. Bennett was not a science fiction specialist, and that turned out to be his advantage. What drew him to the project wasn't the bionics or the technology. It was the character, or more precisely, the lack of a clearly defined one. After screening the pilot and the 2 follow-up movies, Bennett wasn't looking for bigger ideas or louder action. He was looking for the moments that already worked, and asking why the show kept drifting away from them. Bennett immediately recognized the same imbalance the movies had revealed: spectacle overwhelming character. He concluded that the problem wasn't ambition, it was emphasis. His response was decisive. Scenes were stripped back, dialogue was reduced. Lee Majors was directed to underplay rather than project, to let silence, hesitation, and restraint carry scenes instead of overt heroics. The goal wasn't to reinvent Steve Austin into something new, but to remove everything that had been masking who he already was. That shift clarified the show almost immediately. Steve Austin no longer felt like a movie hero stretched across episodic television. He became a figure who could absorb smaller stories, personal setbacks, and recurring relationships without exhausting the premise. Power remained part of the character, but it was no longer the point. What mattered was judgment, when Steve chose to act and when he chose not to. Even Martin Caidin, who had been openly critical of the early direction, later acknowledged the change. Bennett, he said, had brought the show back down to earth, into the realm of believability. The bionics were still there, the action remained, but the center of gravity had shifted back to the man. With that correction in place, the $6 Million Man finally became something sustainable. Not a spectacle designed to impress once, but a character built to return every week. The rebuilt version of Steve Austin didn't rush into action. He assessed situations, he hesitated, he listened.
That's great, then we can move south to the next fault line. Hey, by the way, when you got married, you figured you'd spend this much time in the woods together?
That's why we got married.
That's a good move.
When he acted, it was because the moment demanded it, not because the story needed a spectacle. That restraint showed up in the way Steve occupied scenes. He wasn't always the loudest presence or the fastest to act. Other characters often led conversations while Steve absorbed information. When action finally arrived, it felt reactive rather than performative, a response to circumstance, not a display of ability. What mattered wasn't how powerful Steve was, but the discipline he showed once power was available to him. Strength was present, but never casual. Action felt chosen, not automatic. Before Steve Austin ever spoke a line in the weekly series, the show used the opening credits to tell the audience exactly what it was. Harve Bennett understood that for the show to work, viewers needed to be oriented immediately. The opening sequence became the show's thesis. To execute this, Universal brought in freelance film designer Jack Cole with a single mandate: create something that could summarize the entire story in under 2 minutes, and do it fast. Cole had barely a month to complete the sequence before the series debuted in January of 1974. What he delivered wasn't flashy, it was controlled. The sequence opens not with fantasy, but with reality. Real crash footage, real alarms, real panic. Altimeter readings spin out of control. Warning sirens pulse. Heart monitors beat. The audience is dropped into crisis before they're ever introduced to the hero. That choice mattered. This wasn't a spy film opening with glamour or intrigue. It was a medical emergency. Layer by layer, the sequence reinforces the show's priorities. Medical imagery replaces weaponry. Diagrams replace gadgets. Technical language scrolls across the screen, not to be understood in detail, but to signal logic and process. Cole described his goal simply: hook the audience early and never let go. Even the music, composed by Oliver Nelson, was shaped to align with the tension of the imagery rather than overpower it. The bionics are introduced not as superpowers, but as engineering problems being solved in real time, a framing reinforced by narration which emphasizes cost, risk, and necessity rather than celebration. That consistency is why the opening credits barely changed over the show's run. The credits became a promise. This show would stay grounded, serious, and focused on the man inside the machine. For viewers, that promise mattered. Before an episode could drift, the credits pulled it back. Before a story could get too big, the opening reminded the audience of the stakes. Every week, the show began by rebuilding Steve Austin. What made the $6 Million Man believable wasn't scientific accuracy, it was discipline. From the beginning, Martin Caidin insisted on a simple rule. The show had to obey a logic that felt real, even when the science stretched beyond what was possible. The most obvious example was the crash itself. The footage used in the opening credits wasn't staged. It came from a real 1967 accident involving NASA test pilot Bruce Peterson. The decision to anchor the series in actual aerospace imagery immediately grounded the premise. This wasn't a comic book origin, it was a catastrophe that looked and felt authentic. The show consistently framed bionics as engineering, not magic. Even the liberties the show took were deliberate. Caidin openly acknowledged that a man couldn't run 60 miles an hour the way Steve Austin was shown. The physics didn't work. Leverage would fail and balance would collapse. But explaining those realities on the screen would have bogged down the storytelling. So the production made a conscious trade. They preserved realism of effort instead of realism of mechanics. Steve didn't glide. He strained, his face contorted, his body leaned forward. The slow-motion photography emphasized weight and resistance rather than speed alone. Power looked difficult, not effortless. The visual language mattered more than equations. The same restraint applied to performance. Lee Major's athletic background allowed him to sell movement convincingly. He understood inertia, balance, and momentum. When he ran full speed, knowing that every movement would be magnified on screen. The audience didn't need to be told this, they could feel it. Even when the show bent reality, it never mocked it. The writers and producers knew what couldn't be done and chose not to spotlight it, building trust with viewers who weren't expecting a documentary, only a world that played fair with its own rules. By keeping one foot planted firmly in reality, in real injuries, real effort, real consequences, the show earned permission to explore fantasy without losing credibility. That balance is why the series endured. Not because it was scientifically perfect, but because it respected the intelligence of its audience. Despite its success, The $6 Million Man spent years fighting an image problem. Critics routinely dismissed it as silly, juvenile, or cartoon-like, a charge often leveled at shows that flirt too closely with spectacle. But that reputation misses what actually sustained the series. Beneath the slow motion and sound effects was a character built around restraint rather than excess, credibility rather than fantasy. Even early reviewers who questioned the premise noted how firmly this show anchored its far-fetched idea to emotional reality. That grounding is what allowed the series to age better than many of its contemporaries. 50 years later, The $6 Million Man endures for a reason that has nothing to do with slow motion or sound effects. Steve Austin was never presented as an unstoppable figure. He was rebuilt out of necessity, not ambition. His power came with boundaries, physical, emotional, and moral, and the show never pretended otherwise.
Well, fine, Oscar, you do that. You can reach me at Army headquarters in Norris.
That decision allowed the character to age with his audience instead of burning out in spectacle. That's why Steve Austin doesn't feel dated in the way so many action heroes do. He wasn't built to be admired from a distance. He was built to be believed. And that's the real legacy of the $6 Million Man. Not the bionics, not the technology, not even the myth. It's the idea that rebuilding something broken doesn't require turning it into something else.